You keep telling yourself it was just a joke, a foolish, terrible joke. But the roar of the Smithfield crowd tells you otherwise, and the water in the enormous iron cauldron before you is beginning to bubble. The heat from the pea hits you in waves, a promise of the torment to come. Please, you rasp, I meant no harm, but your words are swallowed by the chaos. This isn't a hanging, it's a spectacle, a new kind of punishment designed to be slow and loud. They drag you up the scaffold. A historian will later write that your roar was mighty loud as they lowered you into the searing liquid. He won't write that it was the beginning of 2 hours of suffering you cannot possibly imagine. All of this, every agonizing second of being boiled alive for a single foolish jest. Your final scolding thought is that the king, it seems, did not share your sense of humor. Your death would become a terrifying legend, a new horror added to the executioner's arsenal. But what was this joke? What simple act performed in the quiet of a bishop's kitchen could possibly lead to a punishment so public, so prolonged, and so full of agony? Bishop John Fisher of Rochester knew he was playing with fire. He'd openly defied King Henry VIII, championing Catherine of Aragon when the king desperately sought to cast her aside. In Tudor England, that kind of defiance carried a price. The year was 1531, and England teetered on the edge of religious revolution. Henry wanted his marriage annulled. The Pope refused, and caught in the middle stood men like Pfizer, principled, stubborn, and increasingly isolated. Fisher's household in Lambeth reflected the tension gripping the nation. Servants whispered in corners. Guards checked every visitor twice. The bishop himself had grown gaunt, the weight of his opposition etched into deep lines on his face. He knew the King Unk S. Wrath was building. Knew that standing for Catherine meant standing against the most powerful man in England. But here's where the atmosphere turned truly sinister. In this age, poison wasn't just a weapon, it was sacrilege. The idea of corrupting food, that most basic necessity of life, struck at the heart of Christian hospitality, and poisoning a man of God, that was an affront to heaven itself. The fear was everywhere. Every meal became a potential death sentence. Noble households employed tasters, men whose sole job was to risk death with every bite. But even that wasn't foolproof. Poisons could be slow-acting, designed to kill hours or even days later. Fisher's enemies multiplied by the day. Some supported the king's great matter. Others resented the bishop's influence. A few simply saw opportunity in chaos. The bishop received death threats, crude drawings of noose and daggers. Once a mysterious package arrived containing a dead rat, its belly swollen with poison. Inside Fish's residence, the kitchen staff worked under a cloud of suspicion. Every ingredient was checked, double-checked. The cooks knew their position. They held the bishop's life in their hands with every meal they prepared. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and they could be accused of attempted murder. Among these cooks was Richard Roose, a man whose name would soon be known throughout England, though not for any reason he could have imagined. He went about his duties like any other servant, preparing meals, managing supplies, trying to stay invisible in a household where visibility could mean danger. The political chess game between Henry and Fisher played out in public debates and private letters. Fisher argued that the king's marriage to Catherine was sacred, unbreakable by any earthly power. Henry countered that the marriage was cursed, evidenced by their lack of male heirs. Both men claimed God's backing. Both refused to yield. February 1531 arrived with bitter cold and mounting tensions. Parliament buzzed with talk of the king's supremacy over the church. Fisher stood almost alone in opposition, his voice growing hoarse from speaking out against what he saw as heresy. His supporters melted away like snow in spring, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. The household at Lambeth operated like a fortress under siege. Visitors were searched. Food deliveries were inspected with paranoid thoroughness. Yet, despite all precautions, danger had a way of seeping through the cracks, because the greatest threats often came not from dramatic assassination attempts, but from the mundane, a powder mixed into porridge, a single moment of misplaced trust. On the morning of February 18th, the kitchen staff rose early as always. Fires were lit, pots were cleaned, ingredients were gathered for the day's meals. It seemed like any other day in a tense but functioning household. Richard Roose took his place among the other cooks, beginning preparations for a simple porridge that would feed both the bishop's guests and the poor who came seeking charity. Nobody could have predicted that this ordinary morning routine would end in death, that by nightfall 2 people would be dead, and the machinery of Tudor justice would be grinding into motion. The powder keg of political tension was about to explode, and Richard Roose would be caught at the very center of the blast. Fisher's household was a tinderbox of anxiety, every shadow hiding a potential threat. And in his kitchens, an ordinary man was about to be caught in the crossfire of kings and bishops, with no idea his life was about to shatter. February 18th, 1531. In Bishop Fisher's bustling kitchen, Richard Roose, the cook, was preparing porridge. It seemed like any other day in the Lambeth household, with servants rushing about their morning duties, and the familiar sounds of bubbling pots and clanging ladles filling the air. The porridge was nothing special, a simple meal meant to fill bellies and warm bones on a cold February morning. Some would go to the bishop's table, where guests had gathered for the day's discussions. The rest would be distributed to the poor, who gathered at the gates, seeking charity from the church. Roose moved through his routine with practiced efficiency. He'd served in Fisher's household long enough to know the rhythms, the expectations. The kitchen was his domain, a place where he exercised what little authority a servant could claim. His fellow workers respected his skill, even if they kept their distance in these suspicious times. Then came the moment that would destroy everything. As Roose stirred the great pot of porridge, he reached for what he would later claim he believed was a harmless powder. Just a pinch, just enough for what he thought would be a jest, a laxative to cause some embarrassment, some rushed trips to the privy, the kind of crude humor that servants sometimes indulged in to break the tension of their daily lives. But the powder wasn't what Roose believed it to be. The porridge was served as normal. In the dining hall, Bishop Fisher's guests began their meal with prayers and conversation. At the gates, the poor received their portions with grateful hands. For a brief time, all seemed well. The morning progressed like any other. Then the first person doubled over. A guest at the bishop's table suddenly clutched his stomach, his face contorting in agony. Before anyone could react, another fell ill, then another. The dining hall erupted in chaos, chairs overturning, people crying out in pain, servants rushing to help. But the horror wasn't confined to the bishop's table. Outside, among the poor who had received charity, similar scenes played out. A woman collapsed in the street, a man began vomiting violently, children cried as their parents writhed in pain, the symptoms struck fast and hard. Violent stomach cramps, uncontrollable vomiting. Some victims turned deathly pale, sweat pouring from their faces. Others shook with convulsions. The sound of retching filled the air, mixed with prayers and pleas for help. 17 people fell grievously ill that morning. The bishop's residence transformed from a place of holy work into a scene from hell itself. Servants ran for physicians. Others tried desperately to help the afflicted, though they had no idea what demon had been unleashed. Among the victims, 2 would not survive. Bennet Kerwin, a guest at the bishop's table, fought for hours before death claimed him. His final moments were spent in agony, his body betraying him as the poison worked its terrible course. The unnamed poor woman who died suffered the same fate, though her passing went largely unrecorded, except as a number in the final tally of the dead. Bishop Fisher himself had narrowly escaped the same fate. By pure chance, or perhaps divine intervention, as he would later claim, he had abstained from the porridge that morning, maintaining a fast for religious observance. He watched in horror as his household descended into chaos, as people he had welcomed to his table suffered before his eyes. The kitchen fell under immediate suspicion. Who had prepared the porridge? Who had access to the ingredients? The finger of accusation swung like a compass needle to its true north, Richard Roose, the cook who had overseen the meal's preparation. Roose's reaction spoke volumes, no surprise at the illnesses, no confusion about how such a thing could happen. Instead, observers would later report, he seemed to sink into himself, the weight of realization crushing down upon him. His harmless jest had become a nightmare. By evening, the immediate crisis had passed, though many victims remained weakened and ill, but 2 facts stood stark and undeniable. 2 people were dead from poison, and the cook had been seen adding something to the porridge. 2 dead, 17 grievously ill, and all eyes in the terrified household. And soon the entire kingdom would turn to one man, Richard Roose. His world had just imploded, and the nightmare was only beginning. "I only meant it as a joke." That was Richard Roose's desperate claim when the authorities descended upon Bishop Fisher's household. A prank gone horribly, fatally wrong, or so he insisted as they dragged him away in chains. The interrogation began immediately in the dark chambers where Tudor justice extracted its truths. Roose faced his accusers. His story came out in fragments, punctuated by denials and pleas for mercy. Yes, he had added something to the porridge. No, he hadn't meant to kill anyone. It was supposed to be a laxative, nothing more, a jest to cause some embarrassment, some discomfort, but certainly not death. But then came the crucial detail that would haunt the entire case. Roose claimed he hadn't acted alone. A stranger, he said, had given him the powder. This mysterious figure had approached him, suggesting the prank, providing the substance, assuring him it was harmless, just a bit of fun at the expense of the bishop's guests. The authorities pressed harder. Who was this stranger? What did he look like? When had this meeting occurred? Roose's answers remained frustratingly vague. The man had been unremarkable, forgettable. The encounter brief and casual, the kind of interaction that happens a dozen times in any London street, notable only in its terrible consequences. Think about Roose's position for a moment. If his story was true, he'd been catastrophically naive. What kind of fool accepts mysterious powders from strangers? What cook, responsible for the health of an entire household, would risk adding unknown substances to food? The very stupidity of its strained belief. But consider the alternative explanations, each more sinister than the last. Perhaps Roose was lying, constructing this stranger to deflect blame from a deliberate murder attempt. Maybe he harbored secret grudges against Fisher or his guests. Or perhaps, and this thought chilled investigators, he was working for someone else, carrying out orders from Fisher's many enemies. The investigation revealed troubling gaps. No one could corroborate Roose's story about the stranger. No witnesses placed him meeting with any suspicious figures. The powder itself, whatever its composition, had been completely consumed in the porridge, leaving no physical evidence to examine. Yet certain details of Roose's account rang true. His shock at the death seemed genuine. Witnesses reported he had turned ghost white when the first victims fell ill. Hardly the reaction of a calculating killer. And would a deliberate poisoner really stick around to face the consequences? He could have fled when the chaos erupted, but instead remained in the kitchen, paralyzed by what he had done. The possibility of Roose as an unwitting pawn opened even darker possibilities. If someone had manipulated him, who stood to gain? Fisher had many enemies, political rivals, religious opponents, those who supported the king's divorce. Any of them might have seen an opportunity to eliminate the troublesome bishop while keeping their own hands clean. The interrogators employed their usual methods to extract the truth. In Tudor England, confession often came at the end of physical persuasion. Yet even under duress, Roose maintained his story. A prank, a stranger, a powder he believed was harmless. The same tale repeated through gritted teeth and tears. Public opinion split violently. Some saw Roose as a village idiot who had accidentally committed mass murder through sheer stupidity. Others viewed him as a cunning killer hiding behind a mask of simplicity. A few whispered about conspiracy, about shadowy forces using kitchen servants as weapons in political games. The authorities faced their own dilemma. If Roose was telling the truth about the stranger, then a more dangerous criminal remained free. But pursuing that phantom figure meant admitting that anyone could be manipulated into poisoning, that every kitchen in England might harbor an unwitting assassin. The implications were terrifying. Time was running out for Roose to prove his innocence. The bodies of Bennett Kerwin and the poor woman demanded justice. The 17 who survived but suffered needed someone to blame. And in the heated political climate of 1531, with the king himself increasingly paranoid about threats to his person, a simple cook's protest of innocence carried little weight. A prankster, a pawn, or a cold-blooded killer, the authorities weren't interested in nuance. They wanted a confession, and in the depths of the Tower of London they had ways of getting one. The news of the Lambeth poisoning reached King Henry VIII within hours, and for Henry, this wasn't just a crime. It was personal. He hated poison with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Think about Henry's position in 1531. He was fighting the Pope, defying centuries of religious tradition, alienating half of Europe in his quest for a divorce. Enemies surrounded him: Catholic loyalists, foreign agents, nobles who questioned his authority. And in his mind, every one of them might resort to poison to stop him. The king's fear wasn't entirely irrational. Poison was the weapon of cowards and conspirators, impossible to defend against. A strong man could fight off an assassin with a blade. Guards could stop an arrow, but poison, it could hide anywhere, in wine, in food, even on the pages of a book. For a man who loved his feasts and earthly pleasures as much as Henry did, the thought of corruption hiding in every meal was unbearable. When Henry learned the details of the Fisher poisoning, his reaction was explosive. Witnesses described him pacing his chambers, voice rising to a roar that sent courtiers scurrying. This wasn't just an attack on Fisher. This was an assault on the very order of the realm. If cooks could poison bishops with impunity, what protection did anyone have? But Henry's fury went deeper than mere security concerns. He saw in this crime a perfect opportunity. Here was a chance to demonstrate his absolute power, to show enemies at home and abroad that he would brook no challenges to authority. The poisoner would become an example, a warning written in suffering and death. The king summoned his counselors for an emergency session. The great men of the realm gathered, sensing the monarch's volcanic mood. Henry didn't wait for formalities. He launched into a tirade about the sanctity of English hospitality, about the cowardice of poisoners, about the need for swift and terrible justice. "This touches us all," Henry declared, his voice carrying that dangerous quiet that preceded his worst rages. Today, a bishop's household; tomorrow, perhaps, the royal table itself. We must act with such severity that no man in England will ever again contemplate such villain. The political dimensions couldn't be ignored. Bishop Fisher was Henry's opponent in the divorce matter. Yet here was the king, positioning himself as the defender of all clergy, all households against the threat of poison. It was a masterful move. By championing harsh justice for Fisher's poisoner, Henry appeared magnanimous while actually tightening his grip on power. Henry announced his intention to address Parliament. Personally, this was unusual. Kings typically worked through ministers and messages, but Henry wanted to be seen taking direct action, wanted his fury to echo through Westminster Hall. The king's advisers tried to inject some caution. What if Roose truly was just a fool who'd been manipulated? What if there were larger conspiracies at work? Henry brushed aside such concerns with characteristic impatience. He had his culprit. Now he needed a punishment that would resonate through history. As word spread of the king's personal involvement, the case transformed. What might have been a simple criminal matter became an affair of state. Foreign ambassadors sent urgent dispatches to their masters. The French envoy noted that Henry seemed almost gleeful beneath his rage, as if he'd been waiting for just such an opportunity. The king's paranoia infected the court. Suddenly, everyone was suspicious of their food. Noble families dismissed kitchen staff on the slightest pretext. Tasters were hired in droves. One courtier famously lived on nothing but bread and water for a week, trusting nothing else. For Richard Roose, languishing in custody, the king's involvement sealed his fate. There would be no quiet judgment, no possibility of mercy. He had become a pawn in a much larger game. Henry's demonstration of absolute power and his warning to all potential enemies. The machinery of royal justice began to turn with terrifying efficiency. Messages flew between the palace and Parliament. Legal scholars were consulted on precedents, and all the while Henry's determination hardened. This wouldn't be ordinary justice. This would be something special, something memorable. With the king himself fueling the outrage, Parliament was ready to act. But no one could predict just how far Henry would go to make an example of Richard Roose, or the terrifying new law that was about to be born from his fury. In 1531, the English Parliament did something unprecedented, something terrifying. They passed a law not for the future, but for the past, specifically for Richard Roose. Session opened with unusual ceremony. King Henry's message was read aloud, his words carrying the weight of royal command. The Lords and Commons listened as the crimes were detailed. 2 dead, 17 poisoned, the sacred trust of hospitality violated. But then came the shocking revelation of the king's intent. Henry wanted a new law, one that would make poisoning equivalent to high treason. Not just murder, but treason, a crime against the crown itself. The legal scholars present understood immediately what this meant. Treason carried special punishments, special procedures. It transformed Roose from a common criminal into an enemy of the state. But here's where the proceedings took their darkest turn. The law wasn't being proposed for future cases. It was being written specifically to condemn a man already in custody for a crime already committed. The Latin phrase ex post facto, after the fact, represented one of the fundamental protections of English law. You couldn't be punished under a law that didn't exist when you committed the act. Henry was demanding Parliament shatter that protection. The debate was remarkably brief. One might expect fierce opposition to such a radical precedent, but fear dominated the chamber. Who would stand up to defend a poisoner? Who would risk the king's wrath by invoking legal niceties? The few voices that raised concerns were quickly drowned out. Lord Chancellor Thomas More, a man who would later die for his principles, remained conspicuously silent. Even he, the greatest legal mind in England, understood that this was not a battle to be fought. The king's will was clear, and opposing it meant risking everything. The act moved through Parliament with stunning speed. Normal procedures were abbreviated or ignored entirely. Committee reviews were perfunctory. The usual back and forth between Lords and Commons was replaced by grim efficiency. Everyone understood the unstated truth. This wasn't legislation. It was a royal decree dressed in parliamentary clothes. The final language of the act was chilling in its specificity. Any person who poisoned another, causing death or bodily harm, would be guilty of high treason. No consideration of intent. No allowance for accident or mistake. The mere act of adding poison to food or drink became equivalent to attempting to overthrow the government. But the act went further. It specified that this law applied to all poisonings that have been committed since the beginning of the present Parliament. A careful reader would note that this perfectly captured Richard Roose's crime while maintaining a veneer of general application. The legal precedent being set was monstrous. If Parliament could retroactively criminalize actions, what protection did any citizen have today? It was poisoning. Tomorrow it might be speaking against the king, or practicing the wrong religion, or simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yet the vote was overwhelming. The few who abstained did so quietly without explanation. The majority raised their hands or voices in support, each man calculating that supporting this injustice was safer than opposing it. The shadow of the tower fell across Westminster Hall. When news of the act reached Roose in his cell, witnesses reported he fell to his knees. His claim of a harmless prank, his story of the mysterious stranger, none of it mattered now. The law had been rewritten to ensure his guilt. He was retroactively a traitor, condemned by words written after his deed. The speed of it all was breathtaking, from crime to new law in a matter of weeks. The Tudor state had shown it could reshape reality itself when motivated by royal fury. If Henry wanted someone guilty of treason, Parliament would make it so, even if it meant twisting time itself. International observers were horrified. The Venetian ambassador wrote that England had abandoned all pretense of lawful procedure. The imperial envoy noted that such retroactive laws were worthy of tyrants, not Christian princes, but their protests meant nothing. Henry had what he wanted. The law was set. Richard Roose was retroactively a traitor, but the act contained one more horrifying innovation, a punishment so grotesque it would send a shudder through the kingdom. A penalty designed to be as cruel as the crime itself. The act for poisoning didn't just define the crime. It prescribed the punishment, and it was a punishment unlike any codified English law before. Richard Roose was to be boiled alive. The Lords and Commons sat in stunned silence when this provision was read aloud. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. The traditional punishment for treason was horrific enough, but this was something from humanity's darkest imagination. The reasoning, if such savagery could be said to have reason, carried a twisted logic. Roose had used cooking to kill. He had corrupted the very act of preparing food, turning sustenance into death. So he would die by cooking, his punishment a mirror of his crime. The lawyers called it poetic justice, though there was nothing poetic about it. King Henry himself was said to have suggested the method. In his chambers, away from public record, he had spoken of making the punishment fit the crime in the most literal sense possible. If a cook poisoned through his craft, let him die by that same craft. Let the fires that should warm honest food instead consume the criminal. But this wasn't just about one man's fate. This was theater, statecraft through horror. Henry understood that fear was a tool of governance, and spectacular punishments created spectacular fear. Every cook in England would remember Richard Roose. Every servant who handled food would think twice before accepting mysterious powders from strangers. The practical details had to be worked out. How does one execute a man by boiling? There was no precedent in English law, no established procedure. Officials scrambled to design the apparatus. A great cauldron would be needed, large enough to hold a man, chains or ropes to lower the condemned, a scaffold to display the spectacle to the crowd. The location was carefully chosen. Smithfield, London's great marketplace, where cattle was slaughtered and meat was sold. Now a man would be cooked alive. The symbolism wasn't subtle. This was where London came to buy food. Now it would witness what happened to those who corrupted food. Word of the unprecedented punishment spread through London like wildfire. In taverns and markets, people discussed it in hushed tones. Some expressed horror at the barbarity. Others, gripped by the same fear of poisoning that motivated the king, approved of the harsh justice. Many simply expressed a morbid curiosity. What would such an execution look like? The international reaction was one of unified disgust. Even in an age accustomed to public executions and judicial torture, boiling alive stood out as exceptionally cruel. The French court, no stranger to harsh justice, expressed shock. The Pope himself was said to have commented on the unchristian savagery of Henry's England, but Henry reveled in attention. Let them call him savage. Let them whisper about English barbarity. They would also whisper about English strength, about a king who protected his subjects with terrible fury. Every enemy considering poison would remember Richard Roose's fate. For Roose himself, learning of his intended death must have been a moment of pure horror. The human mind struggles to comprehend such a fate. Traditional executions, however brutal, were at least familiar, but this to be slowly cooked like a piece of meat, the psychological torture of anticipating such a death might have been worse than the physical reality. Legal scholars rushed to justify the innovation. They cited obscure precedents reaching back to Roman law and biblical punishments. They spoke of deterrence, of the need for memorable justice in dangerous times, but everyone knew the truth. This was Henry's will made manifest. Law bent to serve royal rage. The church's position was particularly awkward. Bishop Fisher, the intended victim, was known for his mercy and compassion. Would he approve of such a punishment enacted in response to an attack on his household? Fisher maintained a careful silence, perhaps understanding that opposing the king's justice would only add to his existing troubles. As preparations continued at Smithfield, London held its breath. The carpenters building the scaffold, the metal workers preparing the cauldron, the wood-gatherers stocking fuel for the fire, all were participating in creating something monstrous and new. The sentence was passed. The method, unique in its horror, was decided. All that remained was for Richard Roose to face the public, the flames, and the cauldron. His final journey to Smithfield was about to begin. For Richard Roose, the Tower of London wasn't just a prison, it was a place of torment. He was tortured on the rack, every stretch, every crack of bone, a prelude to an even greater agony. The Tower's interrogators were thorough professionals. They knew how to extract confessions, how to break a man's will without quite breaking his body beyond use. Roose was needed alive for his spectacular death, so they applied their craft with careful precision. The rack stretched his limbs until joints popped. The strappato dislocated his shoulders, all to confirm what everyone already knew or thought they knew. Under torture, Roose's story wavered. Never fundamentally changed. Yes, he added the powder. No, he didn't know it was deadly poison. The stranger remained frustratingly vague, a phantom that might have been real or might have been born from the marriage of agony and desperate hope. The interrogators noted everything, building their case for the inevitable. Outside the tower walls, London transformed Smithfield into a theater of death. Carpenters erected a special scaffold high enough for all to see. The great cauldron arrived on a reinforced cart, its iron sides already darkened by the forge. Workers dug pits for the fires, calculating how much wood would be needed to maintain a rolling boil for how long, no one knew. No one had done this before. The date was set April 5th, 1531. Word spread through every layer of London society. The nobility made arrangements to watch from nearby windows. Merchants cleared their schedules, the poor began gathering days in advance, claiming the best viewing spots. This would be history, and London wanted to witness it. In his cell, Roose spent his final days in a hell of anticipation. Every sound might herald his last journey. Every footstep could belong to the guards coming to take him. The prison chaplain visited, offering what comfort religion could provide to a man facing such a death. Roose prayed, wept, and sometimes just sat in silence, his mind unable to process what awaited. The night before the execution, Smithfield resembled a fairground. Vendors set up stalls selling food and drink, a grotesque irony given the nature of the next day's spectacle. Children played between the wooden barriers erected to control the crowd. Some enterprising souls sold lucky charms, supposedly proof against poison. April 5th dawned clear and cold. The fires were lit before sunrise, tended by men who avoided eye contact with each other. The cauldron was filled with water from the Thames bucket by bucket. By the time the sun was fully up, steam rose from its surface like morning mist. The crowd swelled to enormous proportions. Contemporary accounts suggest thousands attended, packing every inch of Smithfield. They climbed walls, balanced on rooftops, pressed against the barriers until the wood groaned. The noise was deafening, excited chatter, nervous laughter. The cries of vendors, all building to a crescendo of anticipation. Then came the procession from the tower. Roose, barely able to walk after his tortures, was dragged more than lead. The crowd's noise died to whispers as they got their first look at the condemned man. He appeared already broken, a shadow of whatever he had been before that fatal February morning. At Smithfield, the full horror of the apparatus became clear. The cauldron dominated the square, its size emphasizing the spectacular nature of the punishment. The fires beneath roared with heat that could be felt dozens of feet away. The water inside bubbled and churned like a living thing. Officials read the charges and sentence. Their words were largely lost in the crowd's growing excitement, but key phrases carried: high treason by poison, the king's justice, let all who would corrupt food beware. Roose stood swaying, supported by guards, his eyes fixed on the cauldron with an expression of absolute terror. The executioners made their final preparations. Chains were checked. The fire was stoked to its full fury. The water reached a violent rolling boil. Everything was ready for an act of judicial murder that would scar itself into England's memory. April 5th, 1531. Smithfield was a sea of faces. The fire roared beneath the cauldron, the water already beginning to steam. Richard Roose was brought forth, his body broken, his spirit surely on the verge of shattering. The moment had arrived. The chains bit into Roose's flesh as they lowered him toward the boiling water. The heat hit him in waves, each one worse than the last. When his feet touched the surface, the scream that tore from his throat was barely human. Edward Hall's chronicle captures it with terrible simplicity. He roared mighty loud. The crowd recoiled at that first cry, some turning away, others pressing closer with horrible fascination. Women fainted. Children were quickly hustled away by parents who hadn't anticipated such horror. But many stayed, transfixed by the spectacle of a man being slowly cooked alive. For 2 hours, Richard Roose suffered 2 hours of agony beyond description, beyond comprehension. The executioners had to repeatedly adjust the chains as he thrashed, ensuring the punishment continued as prescribed. The water turned pink, then darker. Steam carried the smell across Smithfield, causing many to retch. When it finally ended, when Roose's cries had long since stopped, the crowd dispersed in unusual silence. The spectacular justice King Henry had demanded left its witnesses changed. They had seen the absolute power of the Tudor state made manifest in the most brutal way possible. But Roose wasn't the last victim of the act for poisoning. Margaret Davy, a young woman who poisoned 3 households in 1542, met the same fate. Like Roose, she was boiled alive, though accounts suggest she was shown the mercy of being partially strangled first. The horror of the punishment hadn't diminished with repetition. The act itself outlived Henry VIII, remaining on the books until young King Edward VI repealed it in 1547. Edward, perhaps influenced by more humanitarian advisers, recognized the law for what it was, a tool of terror masquerading as justice. Its repeal was quiet with little fanfare, as if England was ashamed of what it had allowed. Bishop Fisher, the man whose household sparked this horror, met his own grim fate just 4 years later. In 1535, he was beheaded for refusing to acknowledge Henry as supreme head of the Church of England. The man who had narrowly escaped poisoning died on the block, another victim of the same royal fury that had condemned Roose. The poisoning at Lambeth and its aftermath revealed the terrifying nature of Tudor justice. Laws could be written retroactively. Punishments could be invented to match royal whims. A cook's foolish prank, if that's truly what it was, could spiral into a legal precedent that violated every principle of fair justice. Even today, the story of Richard Roose serves as a warning about the abuse of power. When fear drives legislation, when rulers can reshape law to guarantee convictions, when punishments are designed for spectacle rather than justice, we see the worst capabilities of organized government. In legal textbooks, Russ's case is cited as a prime example of ex post facto law, the tyrannical practice of criminalizing past actions. His execution stands as one of history's most creative cruelties, a punishment so horrible that even the brutal Tudor age quickly abandoned it. The cauldron at Smithfield is long gone, the crowds that watched have been dust for centuries, but the lesson remains. Power without restraint, fear without wisdom, and justice without mercy create horrors that echo through time. Richard Roose died in boiling water, but the real crime was a system that made such a death possible, even celebrated in the name of law.